everybody, and welcome to another video tutorial. Now in this week's tutorial I'm actually using Zbrush. Zbrush is a software I just purchased. I've been waiting a couple years to get it, so I decided to invest in it about last week. Now the work that you're seeing me work on right now is essentially my first attempt at using Zbrush to actually model a character from scratch. So obviously I had to do a lot of research ahead of time to figure out how to do it. And I did try a lot of different techniques. Now I did find that I had to change some of the techniques that I was using for Mesh Mixer because they just weren't as well suited for Zbrush. Zbrush worked better, much better with super general forms and working out the proportions before actually adding some more details and sculpts. It's interesting because when I was working with Mesh Mixer, I didn't find that necessarily an issue. But because Zbrush is so easy to add detail to, it was necessary for me to work out the general proportions first. Now what I did at this stage that you currently see me doing right now is I'm actually looking at cartoon characters for their general proportions and anatomy. By figuring out these heroic essentially proportions, it helps me with my sculpt later on because I already have the proportions figured out and it makes everything a lot easier. Now what I should have done at this stage before reaching this, when I was still using the Z spheres however, is I should have actually modeled out the hands and the toes as well. That's something I did not do, and I do regret not doing that because it did cause quite a few issues later on trying to figure out how to essentially merge certain portions that didn't merge all that well. I did get it to work in the end, but it would have been a lot easier to work in initial stages by adding the hands with the Z spheres. So right now I'm working out the general anatomy. I've already blocked out the general silhouette, so now I just have to add some general information to make sure everything reads correctly. And I'm switching essentially between two different brushes. I'm using the default brush that comes with ZBrush. All of them are default. But I mainly use essentially the clay sculpt tool. I found that one worked the best. I was able to add a lot of muscle fiber details in my sculpt, and it just worked better for the style of sculpting that I had. Now as I went, I used a lot of the move tool as well to essentially double check and ensure that my anatomy and proportions were still consistent with what I was aiming to achieve. So as a test sculpt, this worked out pretty good. What you're seeing is a combination of about 12 to 13 hours of sculpting and research combined, because essentially I was learning how to use ZBrush at the exact same time as the sculpting this. All in all, it actually didn't take too long to learn the basics for ZBrush, although there's these tiny nuances that I found that could get in the way and that required quite a bit of digging sometimes to find out where you were going wrong to figure out how to work around that. But once you figured that out, the rest of it was actually not that difficult. Now, after I finish working on the feet, I will be actually adding in the hands, and you'll notice that I'm using the Z spheres once again once I start doing that. The main reason why I went back to the Z spheres is for blocking out a character. I found that was the easiest method so far. You can also use Z sketch spheres. I did not enjoy using those as much. I found it much easier just to use the Z sphere itself and sculpt with that. So I'm just refining some of the details because I've actually added, at some point I've actually smoothed out some areas, so I do want to make sure that I have exaggerated the anatomy enough so that it shows and reads quite well. There's a couple of tricks to exaggerate anatomy. One is you can do it by color, and then two, it's also by form, and you can also do it with normal maps and displacement maps. Now right now I'm working on the hand. As you can see, I worked out the base size, the base mesh for it with Z-Sphere and brought it in, imported it, and moved it around until I was comfortable with the design and sculpted on top of it. I did merge both layers as well. Now I did find that there was a difference in the density, so I had to go in later on and essentially re-amalgamate the two parts and modify them to make sure that they work correctly. So right now I'm just roughing out the face. I've masked out the rest of the body because I don't want to make any changes on that. I just want to make the changes on the face. I needed to actually mirror also the face because I had an issue where it wasn't perfectly symmetrical. I know that when I was sculpting it, it was an issue, but I simply used the mirror and merge tool that's offered by Zbrush, and it seemed to have fixed the problem pretty well, because when I started sculpting, that issue was pretty much fixed. Now, because the head was initially very low density though in topology and well, in its basic topology, I had to add additional subdivisions, and that created also a deformation in the neck portion because I did that, because essentially there's this line going through his neck which has a higher level of detail than the rest of his body. So these are all things I'm going to have to fix in later on. Now, for the purposes of this video, I did a quick paint over on the character to essentially test out the painting portion before I do a final painting. I still have quite a bit of modeling to do. It was more of a test because I know that as I change the model, that information will become irrelevant, and essentially I'll be destroying to a certain degree the painting that I have done already. But it's also good to figure out now, before I get to that stage, how I'm actually going to approach that. So in the final version, you're going to actually see me with the rough paint in it. And this is a version essentially that it gives me a rough idea. So I did a turntable for the character so I would be able to refer back to it if I did find it better. But generally, every time you paint something again, you tend to get a bit better at it. So I'm not too overly worried about the fact that I'm going to be essentially repainting over quite a few portions. Now I'm adding poly groups right now to the body just to make it a bit easier when I actually start moving the character. This is a trick that I saw in another forum, so I did want to implement that in my character design to make it a bit easier for the posing eventually. Hopefully next week I get to that portion. Right now I've actually just started the basic coloring, so as you can see, I added a very basic coat to the character, and then I went in with highlights and shadows essentially in the muscle areas where I knew that you would see the most blood flow, and I added more red pigment to those areas. It worked out pretty good. What I didn't know, and what I was happy to discover, is that Zbrush not only has a keyboard shortcut for softening out the lines when you're sculpting, but that same keyboard shortcut also works for painting, which is kind of nice. So it ended up saving me actually a lot of time, because I would have spent a lot more time shading this. Now right now I'm actually experimenting with the extrude option for Zbrush, literally to make the pants, and it's actually working out pretty good. It's easy to sculpt on top, and as you can see, this is the turntable for what I have currently for my Zbrush character. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys soon. So thank you and take care.